Hi, friends. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. This is John Kempf, and I have been looking forward to this conversation that we're about to have today for a long time. One of the challenges that I have, there are so many great conversations that I want to have and so many people that I want to talk to that sometimes things get delayed much further than I expect they will. Those of you who've been listening for a while, you'll remember that somewhere in the first 20 episodes or so of the show, I interviewed Gerald Pollack and Walter Yenny, and we had some very interesting conversations about how water behaves and how water moves in ecosystems at an ecosystem level and the impact that that can have. And this is a topic I've been wanting to get back to for some time. And because we often have this conversation around how we can improve our farms and our soil's resilience to climatic extremes, to water extremes. But I think collectively we don't appreciate enough the fact that we can actually have an impact on the climate and we can change the climate in a significant ways when we begin working together collectively. And one of the innovators and researchers whose work I have greatly admired in this space is Alpha Lowe. Alpha has, perhaps more than anyone else that I know of, brought together in a coherent and cohesive way the science and the information available in the space around how water influences climate and how we can manage water and the small water cycle and the overall ecosystem. So, Alpha, thank you for joining us here on the show. I've been looking forward to this discussion. If you can, tell us a little bit about your story, your background, the context, and what is the scope of the work that you're doing today and what you learned along the way.
Cool. Well, I'm very happy and honored to be here on this podcast. My background, I went to graduate school in physics, and then years later, I kind of got involved with permaculture. And when COVID hit, I got really, I was like, wow, this is like a reset chance to really deal with the ecosystem issues because we're suddenly producing a lot less and destroying the environment a lot less. And I started investigating, and I was also in California at the time where we'd been having wildfires for the past few years and really wondering if there was a permaculture solution to the wildfires. And as I investigated, I ran across a Zach Weiss video about the small water cycle that, as you increase the evapotranspiration on the land, you can actually increase the rain. And that there's a way that the landscape can get more hydrated. And I investigated more, and then soon I was kind of connected to a worldwide network of people that I was also helping facilitate with some gatherings. And I just, have dove really deep, more than full time since then, just kind of examining this whole water topic and how it relates to the ecology and the climate.
There's this Native American saying that I've heard describe that the prairie dogs bring the rain. And there's another quote that I forget where it is attributed to that's something to the effect of rain doesn't come from the sky, but rain is planted.
Mm,
And I've been in amongst groups of farmers when that comment was made, where it really raised some eyebrows and lots of question marks. So, when you think about the hydrological cycle and the small water cycle, how is it possible that rain can be planted?
yeah, I think that's a Fukuoka quote, or at least I heard it attributed to him. And I haven't heard the prairie dog, but yes, prairie dogs can influence the rain, and animals, especially beavers and prairie dogs, and also various animals that affect the soil can affect the rain. So that's the quote is referring to the whole feedback loop. We sometimes just think about the climate affecting the land through the rain and the heat because the rain helps the vegetation grow. But actually, there's also the other side of the feedback loop where there's evapotranspiration, and also when it evapotranspires, you're affecting the heat patterns off the land. And so, if a prairie dog is digging holes in the soil that actually allows the rain to infiltrate more into the soil, then the soil can hold the water longer. Like there's probably going to be a lot of rain in the wet season, but it can hold more of the rain into the dry season. And so then you can have more evapotranspiration that then it's called the small water cycle where the water goes from the land to the air to the land and back. And it's also called by the climate scientists precipitation recycling, which I think it would be good to know because the climate scientists and the eco people don't necessarily know about each other because they're using different languages. And that cycle is a cycle. It's not just a one-way street. And so we can plant the rain because the more the soil absorbs the rain, the more you then have available to evapotranspire, or less will go run off to the ocean so quickly. It's like a time delay mechanism where you're not having like purely wet season and then not enough of that water is held into the dry season. So it kind of it spreads it out over the whole year. So then you have more of a consistent rain.
So, what you're describing is that we don't have desertification because of a lack of rainfall. We have desertification because of a lack of holding water in our soils and then having plants capable of releasing that back into the environment to generate rainfall at later times during the growing season.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I mean, it's both. I mean, it is because we're having lack of rain. There are, like certain latitudes on the earth where there's less rain. And so there's that reason. But there's also, yes, what we're doing to the land is also affecting the rain. So it's like both of those factors factor into the lack of rain or too much rain in the case of floods or big hurricanes.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with the small water cycle, can you give us an overview of what is the small water cycle and how does it function when it is functioning well and what causes it to not function well?
So the small water cycle depends on the evapotranspiration and how much of the soil is holding that water in. And so you could argue that it's functioning well when it's able to circulate more. And there's some studies by, I think, Clausen and Clyden that looked at what happened when there was no vegetation on the continents and then when there is, all green. And they found significantly, I forget exactly how much, maybe like 50% more rain, I think, when it's all green as opposed to when it's all desert. So that extra rain is a result of the small water cycle or the precipitation recycling.
And how can we, on the farms that we are managing and are responsible for stewarding, how can we most effectively improve water cycling on our soils and on our farms? What are the mechanisms and the tools that we need to be aware of?
Well, if you increase the carbon content of your soil by 1%, there's a rough estimate that that's about 20,000 more gallons per acre feet that the soil can hold. So that's super significant. That means that the water's being held for longer into the season. It also means that if there are, flooding issues in some areas, then that soil can also be slowing that water down so it doesn't flood some of the urban areas so quickly. And also it helps improve the aquifers. And so there's various things depending on where you are, different ways of cultivating the water. Because a lot of farmlands sometimes also naturally have wetlands, but then it's drained out. But you can still leave some of your farm maybe to have some more natural wetlands. And so you're also wanting to allow the water to seep into the aquifers because the way we're doing a lot of farming these days, like a lot of the aquifers are getting drained. And so in some areas where it's appropriate, you can also do manage recharge. There's a professor at UC Davis, Helen Dalkey, who kind of helping a program in California where certain farms during the wet season, when there's excess rain and then the dams can't hold the rain, they funnel some of that water onto the farm and let it just soak the whole farm for 7 days, and then it will slowly kind of infiltrate into the aquifers. I mean, there's some corollaries. You don't want too much pesticides or synthetic fertilizers in those areas where you're trying to recharge the aquifers that way. And then also trees can be helpful. So the way we do farming nowadays, we tend to not use trees, but trees are in permaculture is called a food forest. Like there's layers. So or agroforestry, you integrate the whole trees into the farming system. And trees can actually help slow down the air. So, and this is research done by Francina Dominguez, a climatologist. Like she found that the air from the ocean, when it's carrying it, has a lot of high speeds, but the trees can slow it down. So when the air molecules slow down, the water vapor molecules slow down, they more likely to find each other, nucleate to form the clouds, and then it rains. So yeah, so those are some of the practices that can be helpful.
Where do you see the big areas of opportunity for agriculture as a whole? There are many of the listeners of the podcast who many are farming hundreds, but also many are farming thousands, in some cases even tens of thousands of acres, or I shouldn't say farming, but responsible for managing and stewarding in the case of ranging and rangeland management, grass management, and so forth. Where are the significant areas of opportunity for us as land stewards to, in addition to the obvious organic matter improvements, are there other management practices that we can utilize to improve water cycling in the local ecosystem?
So farms are part of a whole watershed area. And well, usually when you want to impact the atmospheric flows on a scale that sees more significant impact, you want to get all the land in the area, in the watershed, or at least multiple pieces of land working to infiltrate more rainwater into the land. And so that's a practice that you can kind of build a community of a network of farmers and other people who own land in your watershed area, because the more you can kind of get onto that, then you have this collective phenomena. And then rivers are also very key. And so having, riparian vegetation next to the river and having good soil next to the river, so that when it rains next to the river or a bit away from it, all that water is not just rushing into the river immediately. It takes some time to go through that land and then into the river. And as a in the watershed, you can collectively monitor the groundwater, because the groundwater basins are over a much wider area. Where you infiltrate from one farm, it might it's going to affect that basins everywhere. And so you can kind of do a groundwater monitoring program and also make sure that not too much is being taken out. And there is a key thing that tree roots that at Berkeley, the one of the water groups there, they've been studying how the groundwater affects, how much the land gets hydrated. And they found that during the drought season and dry seasons, the trees are bringing much more rain up from the groundwater than previously thought. And so that's a key factor in hydration that we've kind of forgotten, and has led to, a lot of groundwater depletion around the world. And so it's important that, the groundwater is reachable by the tree roots. So if you drop the groundwater beneath that level, then you're not going to be able to bring up that water during the dry season. So that's another key factor to look at. And certain tree roots go much deeper than others too.
When we think about regenerating the hydrological cycle in an ecosystem, having grasses with deep roots and having trees with deep roots to be able to access water and bring it up and cycle it in through the local atmosphere is a very important piece. But when we look at the agricultural landscape across the Midwest, it used to be true 30 to 40 years ago during peak growing season, if you're talking about peak corn production season after the tasseling stage in the Midwest. I've had many agronomists with decades of experience tell me that a healthy corn crop could go 3 to 4 weeks between rainfalls, because the soil would be able to hold that much moisture. And today, if we don't have rain for a week, then the crop is experiencing a drought. And this is an expression of declining root biomass. It's an expression of a soil having a reduced water holding capacity, reduced carbon. There are a lot of pieces that factor into this. And my sense from the reading that I've done in your work and others' work is something else that is happening is because as the small water cycle is no longer functioning as well, we also no longer have rain coming in, or we no longer have the wind generation. We no longer have air movement and water movement across landscapes from one region to another nearly as efficiently and as effectively as we might have had previously. Is that a correct understanding? And how does the water cycle facilitate water movement across landscapes?
Yeah, that's actually a very complex issue, because wind itself is very complex because it depends on where the land is heating up. And so if there's more heat on a certain area, then that air will convect upwards, and then it can suck in air. And then there's the jet streams, which are these fast moving streams, and they can get blocked in certain areas. And then the temperature of the ocean, which varies because of different patterns of the ocean. When it gets colder or warmer, it affects how much moisture comes in. And then there's a Hadley cell. So there's actually so many factors involved in the wind. It makes it very complex. In the US, there is a general tendency for the winds to blow from the west coast of the US inland, so into the Midwest. And so, like when there was the drought in 2012 in the Great Plains that affected a lot of farms, both Rong Fu, an atmospheric scientist at UCLA, and Francina Dominguez at University of Illinois, in separate studies, they showed how that drought actually originated in California and in certain areas of the Southwest, because it would take several weeks or several months to kind of move slowly. It's called moisture hopping, or moisture hopping is the small water cycle where the water goes up into the air and then blows a little bit inland and then keeps moving. And so that's that's kind of the wind pattern that's moving that water vapor slowly through moisture hopping inland. And so that's really key. And so what we're doing here in the Southwest is affecting the rainfall you're going to get in Ohio, for instance. And what the farmers are doing in the Southwest is affecting the farmers in the Midwest too, because they're influencing the wind patterns and the amount of evapotranspiration that goes up into the air. And so there's the Diego Morales is a magistrate scientist. They're trying to build something called the Precipitation Recycling Watershed Network. So they want different countries to realize that they're affecting the rainfall in their countries by how they're affecting the wind movement and the evapotranspiration. So we have agreements between different countries that are downstream from the upstream countries, because we know that when they take water from the river, it affects them. But what we don't realize is that we're affecting the water vapor and the wind patterns, downwind of us. And so they're proposing that the different countries needing to start making these agreements that you need to restore the land in your area because you're affecting our farms in our country.
This is the concept of water hopping and this biotic pump, if you will, of moving water inland is one of the ideas that I was first really intrigued with and wanted to better understand when I started learning about the small water cycle, because we have this phenomena of the rain shadow west of the Rockies, or excuse me, east of the Rockies. And we have this phenomena of desertification of what happens in the Southwest spreading up into the Midwest in a single season. But then also, I guess I'll frame this as a question: what impact does what happens in the Southwest have over multiple seasons?
A lot of this is still being worked out by climate scientists, like because it's so complex to model. But if you're looking at effects over multiple seasons, you're looking at things like El Nino and La Nina, and there are effects that are over multiple seasons. There's one way that the atmospheric scientists track. They track the memory. There's something called the Hurst exponent. So how the rainfall correlates to previous years or to previous months, and there does seem to be some correlation to previous years. So, but I think exactly why it correlates, there's so many factors that it's not always so clear.
When you described this forest clearing that had an impact on the El Nino cycle, one of the questions that is often asked is what is the scale of local land impact that is required to influence the water cycle, either positively or negatively? How many acres of impact are necessary, or how do we measure that?
I think that's also a complex issue because atmospheric science models right now, like the global models, you have about 100 miles, the grid size. So some of the small effects you have to do the more micro meteorological models, but then they're not necessarily integrating all the larger variables. Milan, he's a meteorologist that was asked by the European Union to look at why Spain was losing its rain. And he figured out that, it was because they were chopping down the forest and paving over the land. So there's less evapotranspiration to add to the moisture. And he gave a rough estimate that he thinks it's about a 6 by 6 mile area. So once you reforest that much or regreen that much area, then you should potentially maybe see an impact on the rainfall within that area. But it also depends on how much the winds are, because if the winds are carrying that rain a lot more further downwind, then you're going to see that impact a lot more further downwind. In valleys, it's actually much less when you don't need to regreen as much to actually have an impact in your area, because the mountains can stop that air moving downwind. And so that water vapor stays in your area. And so it can be significantly less than 6 by 6 miles. In India, Andrew Millison, he's a permaculturist, he went and recorded a lot of what's happening in Maharashtra, India. And in India, like rain is like a lot more of a religious, it's a lot more like it's prayed for, and it's like people celebrate the rain. In the US, I think we sometimes look negatively when it rains. The monsoons are really important, but the problem is in the dry season they didn't have as much rain, and there's this project called the Water Cup where they regreened I think 8,000 villages, like in a kind of competition cooperation game. And they found that the villagers would track in their village when they regreened and reforested and also caught the rain in the ponds, that the rainfall increased. And so in these kind of village size areas, they were able to, in some cases, see increases in the rain. And I think there's also been studies in similar areas where there's certain areas where there's forested or not forested, and they saw it affected the rain in that area when they did these studies.
I'm trying to think of what direction to take this conversation because there are so many nuances of climatology that we could get into, but instead I'll ask the question, what are the things that you wish all land stewards knew and were informed about?
One of the key things is slowing water down is super important because basically, I mean, the water naturally slowed down in the past through the various mechanisms, through the richer soil, more forests. The beavers were slowing down the rivers and damming them up. And actually, beavers have a super important impact on American history. But as we've kind of paved over and dried up and deteriorated the soil, like that slowing down has not happened, and so the waters are sped up in the way to the ocean. So it's not staying there into the dry season. So that would be one of the key aspects. And then I think an understanding of the small water cycle is key. So there's this phrase Brock Dolman coined called "slow it, sink it, spread it." So you want to slow the water, sink the water in the aquifers, and then spread it laterally. And then I added hop it and lift it because I think you also want to think about how the water's go into the air and hopping, moisture hopping, and also the tree roots. They can lift up the water from the groundwater. So those are some key concepts.
Alpha, as you've looked at and been able to interact with people who are studying climate and water cycles from all over the globe, one of the pieces that you've done remarkably well is organizing that information on your blog on Substack. And for all of our listeners, we'll include the link in our show notes because this is a very valuable resource that I would definitely encourage everyone to spend some time with reading. Please subscribe, and also please consider supporting Alpha in his work because it's my understanding this is one of the this is an important mechanism for funding his work and his continued research. In addition to those pieces that you've organized so well, Alpha, what other resources would you really recommend and encourage people to go take a look at to learn more?
Yeah, Erica Geese has a cool book, Water Always Wins. I think the Eco Restoration Alliance is now starting a kind of a blog where a cooperative, collective blog where they're bringing a lot of pieces written by different people. On Substack, there's a guy, Rob Lewis. I forget exactly, the Climate According to Life or something. Yeah, there are a lot of references in my Substack, which is climatewaterproject.substack.com. So you can kind of go down many rabbit holes. There's one earlier piece where I have a list of a lot of references of different, maybe 400 scientific articles that you can kind of go through. And then, yeah, there's always links to the different people I've interviewed on my podcasts that you can then click on their link. So, like, I just recently interviewed Lilo Phillips, who wrote the book Beaverland, and the guy Over the Sea, who wrote Over the Sea, Stephen Miller. So, anyway, like different people have different collective references. My podcast is on my Substack, but you can also see it on Apple Podcast and Spotify too.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Alpha, thank you for all the great work that you're doing. When we think about being good stewards of the land and the landscapes, then sharing what we're learning with other people and having a collective impact, when we realize that working together collectively, we can really stabilize and improve our climate in a significant way, is very empowering. And it's knowledge that is only effective when it's shared. We need to share it. We need to have many more people be aware of this information in order to really have the scale and the impact that is necessary. So,
Yeah, so one of the ideas is there's a kind of, perhaps there's a climate calming effect that can happen from all this vegetation. And there's a variety of natural disasters with quote unquote around the natural. We're having this more floods these days, more droughts and more fires. And this is especially prevalent in Australia and California, where there's this been huge cycle and they actually impact each other. So it's not purely a climactic effect. It's actually partly the land too that's affecting it, because let's say you have more droughts, that's going to dry out the land. So then you have more fire, and that's a natural thing that people understand. But the connection of why fires lead to more floods is not fully understood by everyone, by the mainstream, because there's one effect is that the fires, when they're really intense heat, it actually creates this hydrophobic, which means water repellent surface, a waxy surface on the soil. So in Australia, when there were these huge fires over the last decade, you see these huge floods that 1 million people had to were asked to evacuate a year later, because in the hills where there were the huge fires, the water, when it rained, it flowed down the mountains and the hills and collected in the urban areas lower down. And so, I mean, fires, when they're smaller, which is more of a natural effect, they're not going to create as much of the hydrophobic effect. So it's more because we've various things we've done to the environment that we have these really huge fires now that's leading this issue. But then that leads to more floods. And then the floods wash away huge amounts of soil. And that soil is critical, to hold the rain when it comes down next in the drought season. And so when you do have the drought season, it's a lot worse because you don't have all this soil. And also you have less of the small water cycle. You have less aquifers and less groundwater in the aquifers. And so you're also affecting the rains. And so there's this feedback loop from the floods to more drought, which leads to more fires. And so that's been happening particularly at the California and Australia level, because they're at those latitude levels where they're most vulnerable to this. But now it's starting to spread up to Oregon and Washington and even slowly into Canada, that they're getting more wildfires. And so we're at a very dangerous stage of this rapid desertification of the whole landscape. And yeah, I mean, it still needs to be, a lot of this atmospheric science needs to be worked out. But there were some studies around the forests, when the ones that weren't cut down, the ones that were, that there was more extreme weather. Like there was bigger rains and also longer droughts where the forests were cut down. And so there may be some kind of calming effect of all the forests. And there's various reasons possibly this could be, and that's still being figured out. But when the land is vastly heated up, that actually does draw in more ocean winds because of the convection upwards, which can then actually lead to larger rains. And then because you're also having less of the small water cycle, then there's less of that, a smaller regular rain that's happening. Anyway, this all still needs to be worked out. But there's all this extreme weather that can be affected by the land, and also ties into this whole fire, flood, drought cycle.
Given your understanding of, as you frequently keep referring to, there are lots of details that still need to be better understood. But given what we presently understand, if we were to collectively implement what we already know, how might the landscape change? How might the weather patterns stabilize? What does perhaps an idealistic vision of the future look like? In other words, what are the possibilities really if we were able to collectively implement what it is we already know?
Yeah, I think the landscape, well, we want to integrate a lot of the different multiple organisms into it, integrate the biodiversity into the landscape. So it's not just the plants, but the beavers, the prairie dogs, the microorganisms. These are all really important, and they form this really complex system that's kind of like with checks and balances. And so, like, the whole biodiversity issue is related to the climate issue, but they're often treated as separate things. But they're very well interlinked. The guy James Lovelock, who came up with the idea of Gaia, the Earth as a living organism, he did some simulations. It's called Daisy World, where the you know they had a very simple toy model with white daisies and black daisies, and he found that the whole system would actually self-regulate. Like the black daisy and the white daisies would grow or die in a ratio that would then create a constant temperature. And then they introduced animals into it, like rabbits that would eat the daisies and then foxes that would eat the rabbits. And interestingly enough, those things also help to kind of regulate the whole environment, because they would regulate the amount of daisies. And so there's this huge feedback loop, like all the trophic levels, that's kind of regulating the interaction between the land and the ecosystem. And beavers in North America and Europe are especially important because there was like 50 to 300 million beavers in the North America that were changing the waterways. They were damming it all up, creating wetlands after wetlands, these network of wetlands. And when we killed them, the beavers from the 1600 to the 1900s, that was called I think Ellen Wohl, a geomorphologist, coined the term the Great Drying. And we kind of dried out a lot of the North America. And now we're kind of doing it man-made drying out since the 1900s. So it's this huge effect. And that, if you think about it, there's all that water on the land has to feedback loop up into the atmosphere and then come back down. And so that is the precipitation recycling, the small water cycle that has been lost over the last 400, 500 years, that to a massive scale. And so I think rewilding, like reintegrating the beaver, which would mean shifting our cultural understanding. But like the beavers could be one major thing we could do for the landscape hydration and also for the climate, and also dealing with the water scarcity issues, because they can help us slow the water down, and they can do it at much cheaper rates. Like in, I think, Chesapeake Bay, they found that the beavers could do for free what the human water engineers would require $1 million to $2 million to cleanse the water, because the wetlands cleanse the water. And in California, they're now the Governor Newsom has a beaver department, so they're recognizing the importance. And all over the Southwest, farmers that used to be hate beavers are now actually praising them because they've saved some of the hydration in their land. So I think looking at the keystone species in the water cycle to restore it, and it could be prairie dogs, and then also certain microorganisms and certain insects that really help build up our soil. Like, we want to create that richness. And then, with the whole planting, it's because it's a complex system, and like it requires some kind of tapping into that understanding of the ecosystem, and indigenous plants are often good. It's this complex ecosystem we're trying to regrow again. And as we regrow it, and if there's more trees and vegetation to evapotranspire, that rain will also increase. And so it's this kind of natural loop. It's a self-reinforcing loop. So that rain can then help everything grow. But if we don't do that, we're getting this, what Zach Weiss calls the watershed death spiral, the fire, flood, drought cycle, that's going to make everything worse. And it's possible. People have speculated that because the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East was once fertile 8,000 years ago, and there was some climate, wobbling of the earth. But there's also possibly what the people there did. They might have set off this watershed death spiral by clear cutting forests, and so we're kind of at a very dangerous stage in Earth's history, that we could be setting off, this desertification, which then leads to more climactic extremes.
One of the questions that comes to mind when you talk about the intense wildfires that created hydrophobic soil, we see this phenomena on agricultural soils where the soils are left bare and exposed to the sun. And as those soils essentially bake in the sun, they obviously that degrades and destroys the soil microbiology in the top couple inches of that soil, where soil temperatures can go up to 140 to 150 degrees a couple inches down from the soil surface. Is this a parallel to what is happening with the intense forest fires? What is a comparison? How much heat do those soils get exposed to in the intense wildfires?
I don't know the numbers, but yeah, definitely when you have bare ground, there's much more of a heating effect. And yeah, if you just put a thermometer like where there's bare ground or where there's grass or where there's vegetation, you'll see a huge jump in temperature, maybe, you know, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And yeah, it may very well be playing a role in creating some of this temperature effects that then also is influencing the wildfires. I also like to talk about the whole water infrastructure of our countries. Like, we're moving vast amounts of water, say the Colorado River, like a trillion gallons a year is being piped to 7 different states. Like, and Arizona most recently had, they built what's called the Cap Canal that now supplies water to Phoenix and the cities in Arizona. And that means that a lot of that water that was naturally flowing down the Colorado River and that was in wet seasons overflowing the banks and filling up, creating wetlands next to it, having a rich ecosystem of animals and microorganisms, and then that water was being evapotranspired into the air. And nearer where it goes out into the Gulf of California, like that last 100 miles, that used to be 10 miles wide, but now it's just much thinner, thread of river. And so that water traditionally could be precipitation recycling. So there's this huge effect all along the river and next to it of like how much the vegetation and all that silt sediment that's being trapped in dams that's not overflowing. And so that there's huge impact on the whole ecosystem. And when we're funneling it to all the farms in Central Valley in California and other places, and to the cities in San Diego and Los Angeles, when it goes to those big cities, often it doesn't get recycled and it just flows out to the ocean. So it doesn't get a chance to kind of really infiltrate into the landscape. And so that has a big impact on the evapotranspiration. So we're having a huge impact on the small water cycle through this massive trillion gallons a year of redirecting the water. And I think we really need to look at that impact because, like a lot of farmlands, depending on the Colorado River for the water. And so we're looking at ways to save water, but we're really not looking at the vast impact of the precipitation recycling small water cycle on this whole water scarcity issue for the Colorado River. And so we really need to look at, do we want to be aqueducting huge amounts of water? Because after they built the aqueduct into Arizona, like now it's allowed a lot more people to move there, which creates even more stress on the system. And so part of what Erica Gies, who wrote Water Always Wins, and Stephen Miller, who wrote Over the Sea, they're saying that no, we should look at like not incentivizing people to move to those areas, or we should incentivize the farms to be producing more where there's more rain and less where we're having to funnel huge amounts. And that like California uses 20% of its electricity, the total state budget, just to move water around, which is an enormous amount of energy, which creates huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And so that climate warming then it creates more further climate chaos. So we've created this weird feedback loops that really we need a lot more research. And I mean, we have to kind of understand these loops and how that then impacts like all the rain we get in the Great Plains and the Midwest. And like it's just not being looked at in government or enough, like, and by the whole farming community. Like there's this huge movement of water. Like we're looking mainly just on the ground, and we're ignoring the whole movement and how we can influence that whole channel of water up in the air. And at the rate we're using up water, like in the Great Plains, like there could be huge issues by 2050 or even earlier, like because the Ogallala and the aquifer and all the aquifers are being used up their water. And if the rain continues to decrease, both from global warming and also from the small water cycle decrease, like there's like very big implications. And there are lots of people looking at this whole issue, but they're not looking at the atmospheric small water cycle as it being a huge deal in this whole system.
And I think within the agricultural community, within the farming community, one of the reasons it's the atmospheric movement of water hasn't really been considered a great deal is because it's been assumed that we have no influence over it, that it is due to factors that are outside of our control. And that may be true for us as individual farmers, particularly if we're on a smaller scale, but it is not true when we work collectively.
Yeah, and that it's not like the climate scientists haven't been aware, but like climate scientists are not always, they're academics and they're not always like really pushing their message. Like Hubert Savanage in Netherlands, he wrote some papers like saying we really need to look at this more importantly, but there hasn't been that kind of like energetic push. And like people, the climate scientists who are doing precipitation recycling, they realize, oh yeah, we can impact this. But yeah, it's like, I don't know, I think it requires a lot more collaboration between the atmospheric scientists and the eco people and the farmers and the government to kind of raise this issue. Kind of similar to how soil was not as big of an issue 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And since then, it's somehow risen in the consciousness, even in the presidential debates. There's movies about it, like Kiss the Ground. Like, I feel like we're getting to that stage where this whole water issue, if we can utilize and bring together all the different forces to we can create a regenerative water movement that maybe rise to prominence the same way that soil issue did in the last 15 years.
Well, I think what I hear you saying is that without addressing, in a regenerative manner, without addressing the water movement in the atmosphere, then a regenerative conversation around soil is somewhat hollow or incomplete because without addressing the other, in a long-term ecosystem level perspective, then we will never realize the full opportunity of what is possible, the full potential of what is possible by regenerating soil alone.
I think because there's like many cycles and complexities of this, it's kind of like We have to kind of increase that. It's almost like the paradigms we're using to look at this and increase it to the atmosphere. And then also increase just to understand the whole complex systems view, because the groundwater and the surface water and the atmospheric water, they're all coupled. And so as we use up the groundwater, that's also influencing the small water cycle too. So that's what Francina Dominguez is. She did her research in the Amazon and looked at how the groundwater also impacted the whole small water cycle, precipitation recycling. So it's kind of like creating more complex systems viewpoint that we kind of open the public to, and also realizing there are simple ways to kind of express it, like the small water cycle being one of them, and this whole slow water being another. And the slow it, sink it, spread it, hop it, lift it. So there's simple ways we can kind of get the messaging out so that it begins to be understood.
What other thoughts would you like to add to the conversation that we've missed so far?
Yeah, just to understand that the draining of our continents and the draining of the groundwater, like I think it has a significant impact on wildfires. And we've tended to focus on to stop wildfires on fuel reduction, which means chopping down trees or vegetation or clearing brush. We really need to focus more on the whole water issue, because the ways we are doing the mass shipment of water with the aqueducting of water, like that's meaning that certain areas of the land become way more dried out, and that water instead gets piped to cities. Like that could potentially be having a huge impact on wildfires. And the way we're draining the groundwater, that has an impact on the wildfires. So, I mean, this is like $1 billion issue in many cities all around the world, because we're having these, like fires. And we need to really shift that paradigm for fire management all around the world. And also, we need a lot more research. There's very little research done on how groundwater affects wildfires right now. So, to any atmospheric scientists or hydrologists listening, that's an area to do some more research so that we can have more. But hydrologists have found that trees are bringing up the water to hydrate the land, which naturally should, I mean, intuitively should lessen the wildfires. And that's what, Zach Weiss and other more land eco people have been saying. So I think more research in this area will help the governments look at it.
There are multiple aspects to depleting groundwater. One of the pieces that I don't think many people are aware of is when we think of depleting groundwater, we often think of it in terms of extracting groundwater for irrigation, depleting aquifers, and so forth. But I saw a groundwater map of the Midwest several years ago that showed remarkable groundwater depletion. And in these hot spots, there were hot spots scattered all across the Midwest. And the hot spots didn't match with the cropping cycle and the crop context of what crops were being grown there. So I started looking closely at what does this correlate with? And in every zone where the groundwater was being rapidly depleted corresponded with an ethanol plant, where the ethanol plant was extracting lots of groundwater for their manufacturing process. So
Mm.
I think there are multiple aspects of what is happening in agriculture that we need to start paying closer attention to.
Yeah, that makes sense what you observed. Yeah, and I think it seems like the government is waking up. There's now groundwater acts that you can't, take too much groundwater. But I don't know if they're aware of, like, because often it's now beneath the tree root levels, and so we really want to figure out how to really, at least get the groundwater to that level again, to the tree roots, able to bring it up, both from the hydrating land aspect and also from the wildfire perspective.
Wonderful. Well, I've kind of tapped out of questions. Thank you for picking me up and bailing me out a little bit here and adding in some of our thoughts. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or should we wrap it up?
For farming, like there are a variety of farming practices that are a lot better for the whole water cycle, and so to use polyculture instead of monoculture, because I think there were some studies that showed that the carbon content actually increased more and it will absorb more water when you're actually having more polycultures, which also lead to richer, microorganisms in the soil. Yeah, and using more the multi-level, the trees in your farming is really helpful.
And those are all conversations that we have here regularly on the podcast. Is how can we increase species diversity of the plants growing on a landscape, both with intercropping and relay cropping and cover cropping, etc. Those are all important pieces. There are a few, but there are not very many recorded instances of there being downsides to increasing plant diversity. Usually just the opposite. Whenever we improve diversity, then we improve the overall ecosystem functioning.
Cool. I'm glad you guys are having a lot of that conversation.
Well, Alpha, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience and what you have learned. And it is my desire that your knowledge and experience becomes much more widely known throughout all of the agricultural community. So thank you for being here and for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.